From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman. How you doing, David?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, ready to go.
All right, very good. We have an excellent show for you today. Today, we're going to get to a lot of your listener questions. I know we promise this every show, and sometimes we don't get to it. But this time, I guarantee you, we will work our way through your questions, submitted either through Facebook or the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. So hang on for that in the second half. We will also, as has become our custom, check in with the corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, at the National Press Building in Washington, D.C. But before any of that happens, we're going to talk about community wealth building. So, David, tell us about our featured guest today.
Our first guest is Gar Alperovitz. He is the author of The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, a book that insists America did not need to drop the bomb on the Japanese to win World War II. We'll get to that later on in the show. Gar has an impressive resume. We could devote an entire show just listing his achievements. Suffice to say, Dr. Alperovitz is an historian, political economist, activist, writer, and government official. In addition to a distinguished career in academia, he is also the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is a co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative, a research institution developing practical, policy-focused, and systematic paths towards ecologically sustainable, community-oriented change and the democratization of wealth. He is also the co-chair of the Next System Project, a project of the Democracy Collaborative. Welcome, Gar Alperovitz.
Good to be with you.
Good to have you on the program, Gar. Gar and I go back a long way, which illustrates that he has experience in Congress as well, because I first met him back in the 60s when he was a chief of staff of Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin, a great progressive senator. And Gar and I worked on many issues, but especially the tire safety bill that Senator Gaylord Nelson spearheaded, which became law. And it's important when we talk with Gar Alperovitz to bring down a lot of his proposals to the very necessities of the people in this country, especially tens of millions of poor people, whether they're going to have enough food, enough shelter, enough heat in the winter, whether they're going to have adequate public transit, what kind of community neighborhoods they're going to live in. And his description of what he's doing started out with this short sentence, which I think opens the discussion properly. Quote, few Americans are aware of the steady buildup of innovative community wealth-building strategies throughout the United States. CommunityWealth.org brings together, for the first time, information about these institutions that are multiplying dramatically in recent years throughout the country. We read the business pages of the papers, and it's all about big business and conventional small business, which is almost heavily franchised businesses like McDonald's franchises or Jiffy Lube franchises. But what Gar is going to talk about today is quite different and quite exciting. So what do you mean by community assets?
The starting point on all this, I think, is to recognize that a mere 400 people, you could get them in, a small conference room, have more wealth themselves than the bottom 186 million people taken together. Wealth ownership is extremely concentrated in the United States. I once said in a lecture that it's almost feudal or medieval, and a medieval historian came up to me afterward and said, it was never that bad in the medieval era. This is far, far more concentrated. Wealth building, community wealth building, is attempting to build up ownership in a democratic form. The most obvious one, the most common one in people's experience, is an ordinary co-op, in which it's a one-person, one-vote form of holding wealth. And if you count all the co-ops in the country, some are agricultural, some, of course, the big credit unions are one-person, one-vote banks. There are 130 million Americans who are participating in one way or another in some form of democratic ownership of wealth, production, or investment. So that's the general idea, but it is exploding around the country, and the local newspapers just haven't been covering it yet.
You talk a lot about community development organizations. Explain that, how many there are, what do they do back in the neighborhoods and communities around the country?
It's a hard number to come to because there's so many different forms. I mean, the old form of community development corporations, which still exist, there were many, many hundreds of them around the country, basically tried to set up housing and small business. The new strategies are basically trying to set up actual ownership of wealth. Now, nobody's got a really good count of this because, as I say, the local newspapers, one, don't want to report on it. They don't do any business reporting that it has to do with common or democratic ownership. And, they're pretty much, the local newspapers are very, very stressed financially, so they don't really even have the reporters. So if you go to that website you mentioned, you'll find lots and lots of detail because that agglomerates information. But let me give you an example of one of the most exciting ones, and to give you an idea of what's happening in the country. In Cleveland, and it's a project we worked on, in a neighborhood of about 40,000 people, mostly black, the average family income is about $18,000, really low income average. And unemployment is of about 22%, extreme unemployment. Well, right in the middle of that neighborhood, about 40,000 people, there is a neighborhood corporation. It's a nonprofit corporation for the whole neighborhood. And attached to it are worker-owned cooperatives. They're not freestanding. They're connected to a community-building nonprofit corporation. And they're not, little corporate. They're not tiny. For instance, one of them is a very advanced solar installation company, and it's worker-owned but also connected to this neighborhood complex. It has a huge production. It's got one of the largest urban solar installations in the country, a field that they've established. A second one would be it's an industrial-scale laundry, again, owned by the workers as part of this complex. And industrial scale means it supplies hospitals and universities and nursing homes, and again, worker-owned. And then the third one is an urban greenhouse. And again, not small. This one is capable of producing something like 3 million heads of lettuce a year. So this is the complex, and its further feature of it, and this is beginning to happen in many parts of the country, right in the middle of this neighborhood, this very poor neighborhood, and typical around the country, are three big quasi-public institutions. That is to say, the Cleveland Clinic, world-famous hospitals right there. University Hospital is there, and Case Western Reserve University is there. Well, they buy together $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services, mostly from wherever they've been buying. But now they've begun to concentrate some of their purchases, and a lot of taxpayer money in hospitals and universities, and that they're trying to use some of the leverage to support this neighborhood building complex of worker co-ops. So it's a very sophisticated development that kind of moves forward. It's called the Evergreen Corporation. It's beginning to move forward in smaller ways in different parts of the country. There's a smaller one in Atlanta, one being developed in Richmond, Virginia. There's another one being developed in Jackson, Florida, and there was one in Jacksonville, Florida. There's several around the country in smaller scale that are beginning to move in exactly the same parallel direction, transforming ownership in a way that is democratic, but also building neighborhoods and building worker self-management and a whole different model that is a very democratic model.
What's the big block for not spreading even faster than what you indicated? Is it that the big banks are not interested in providing credit, that the co-op banks are mostly in the farm area, coming out of the 1930s when they were organized to provide credit for farmers? But is credit shortages the problem here? I take it the Small Business Administration is not very active in this area.
Credit is part of the problem. I think what's really interesting is partly it's knowledge that you can actually do this. I mean, people don't realize that it can be done. Partly it's startup funding. So think about it this way. If you can, and this is true in any city that's got big universities or hospitals, if you can convince them, and it's in their interest to do this, to begin buying locally from something that helps build the community, if they give you a contract, for instance, to do the laundry or to buy the lettuce or even to put a solar installation in, you can go to the bank with that and get credit. So that becomes the marketing is the really big part of this. The other piece is startup funding, and I think this is where federal government could play a major role. A big corporation going into any business situation sets up a team. They go in and survey what can be done and what stages of development, and what kind of financing is needed, what programs, government programs are available, state, local, and national. And there's a whole startup complex before they start making money. That's a big piece of the puzzle, how to get that rolling in the community. Community foundations can play a big role in this, and they're beginning to kind of turn their attention to it. The Cleveland Foundation, which was behind in part this development I just mentioned, it's literally the oldest community foundation, not only in the United States, but in the world. It's the kind of granddaddy of them all. And they've pioneered some of this, and we're beginning to see different foundations, community foundations, oriented to trying to begin to use this.
Gar, we're in a presidential campaign, and for once, with Bernie Sanders running as a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, the word socialism is coming into currency again. People praising it, attacking it. And it's really local socialism. I mean, there really aren't anybody around in politics saying that we should nationalize the defense industry, although John Kenneth Galbraith thought we should have. Why don't you talk about local socialism? I just wrote a column saying local socialism is American as apple pie. It goes back over 200 years. And if you don't believe it, look at your post office, look at your public library, look at your public works, look at all kinds of local institutions. One sentence in your material stood out, and I'd like you to talk about it because it should become part of the presidential campaign here. And you say, quote, "In one of the fastest growing and most interesting innovations, a host of local municipal enterprises that help anchor jobs and contribute to the tax base have gained the support of Republican and Democratic mayors alike," end quote. What are you talking about?
Well, that's what's interesting about this. Again, if you go back to this Cleveland model, on the ground, you could actually call this community socialism, as you did, Ralph. What is it? Because it's community ownership and in this case, it's community and worker ownership combined. And you can call that a form of socialism, but it is as American as apple pie. 130 million people in the United States today are members of one or another form of co-op. Very, very conventional, very common. So what really counts on the ground in our experience is, and this is with conservatives as well, I don't mean the Washington-type rhetoric that you get from politicians just trying to, create controversy. I mean genuine conservatives at the local level. And I go back to my boyhood friends in Wisconsin, where I'm from. And I have a very good conservative friend who's a good example. On the ground, what he's interested in, does this work? Is it practical? Do these people get a share in the ownership? Does it produce results? Is it effective? And he's all for it if it's effective and practical. And that's our experience. You get away from the Washington rhetoric to people who care about locality. It becomes very, very interesting.
Yeah, just to look at an example, you ask people around the country, do you believe in local socialism? They say no. I said, well, you ever hear of the public drinking water department? Do you ever hear of the post office? Do you ever hear of the public highways? Do you ever hear of all kinds of things that have been established by our forebears? What's interesting, like Nebraska is a bastion of Republican conservatism, and it has a public utility, a big public utility. New Hampshire, a bastion of right-wing Republican conservatism. All the liquor stores are owned by the state of New Hampshire. So it's important to have this kind of discussion. So let me ask you, Gar, is Bernie Sanders talking about this? Because he's going to be challenged because he calls himself a democratic socialist, and I thought he sort of bumbled the answer when he was questioned on a debate a few days ago, the Democratic debate. You think, because he's in the eye of the media now, anything he says is news. Do you think he's going to pick this up, all this work that you and others have been doing to establish and build local wealth and local services for millions of people around the country?
Well, I hope he will. The one thing that we know he has talked about, I think he mentioned the other day in one of his talks something about the local police and the local fire department are a couple of good examples of socialism in the United States. But what he has been kind of backing for some time now is worker co-ops. He's got a couple pieces of legislation to support worker-owned co-ops. I haven't heard him talk about it, but I'd certainly like to hear him go further in that direction. Let me pick up on what you said about Nebraska. Nebraska is a very red conservative state. There are no private utilities in Nebraska.
That's
the
right.
entire state is publicly owned utilities, and they make a profit for the state. So you find this very, very conservative state looking at these actual practicality of it and very supportive. That's true throughout the South. There are lots of, 25%. I guess here's a good figure on this. 25% of electricity now in the United States is done either through city-owned public utilities or public utilities and co-ops, another form of democratic ownership, if you like.
Rural electric co-ops.
Rural electric, but other co-ops as well that are in one way or another public or cooperative, 25%. So it's a very, when you start, and the whole community wealth building effort that we're seeing around the country all begins at the neighborhood or the cooperative level, and then only kind of gets bigger if you have to because of some technical or larger reasons. So it's very traditionally American, and I think it's growing in significant part, and this is the driving force of this, what we're finding, is because everything else is failing, to tell you the truth. That is, the political system is jammed. There's no capacity to move money in a serious, traditional way of the old kind of liberal ways that used to be possible. So there's the business community and the corporations are not interested in what's going on locally in this way. So the pain levels are developing. And what we're finding is that people are kind of looking at what can you do, and they discover that you're going to have to roll up your sleeves, and if you start doing something locally, it's got to be benefiting a lot of folks, and the cooperative or community or neighborhood corporations become logical answers to that when you actually look at what's feasible. I think that's what's driving this development.
And actually, there's a bigger issue here. There's a huge area in our country, in the Tennessee Valley, that was extremely poor, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a government corporation, was established, led by Senator Norris from Nebraska in the U.S. Senate in the 1930s, to generate and distribute electricity more than any other institution. It helped economic development, including capitalist development, in those states in the South, in Tennessee and going on south in Alabama. Not only that, but whenever big capitalism gets in trouble, what bails them out? It's called socialism, government bailouts, the U.S. taxpayer. So let's get rid of this propaganda. I think we really got to put everything on the table. And let me ask you this question, Gar.
And let me tell you something. Let me just go back to your Tennessee Valley Authority, because that's a good one, Ralph. So this is huge public corporation, definitely a socialist corporation. It's the biggest one in the United States. And there it sits right in the Tennessee Valley. There's somebody in probably the Bureau of the Budget of the Obama administration had a bright idea. Why don't we sell it off to the private corporations? And the outrage saying against it from the Tennessee Valley political people was huge, led by the Republican conservatives who really wanted to keep that there because their constituents liked it. And that's another example. If it's practical, you can make it happen.
Yeah. One qualification, as David Freeman, who headed the Tennessee Valley Authority, told me on more than one occasion, they went nuclear big, and they paid a big price, but they just opened the first new nuclear plant since the 1970s in the Tennessee Valley. But apart from this, let me ask you this question. When I look at your materials, what jumps out at me is the lack of fervor by ordinary people who know that they're serviced every day by these public institutions that we've just talked about. A more recent one is this. There are 30 million people in this country that banks aren't interested in. They don't want to have them have savings accounts or checking accounts. It's not worth their trouble for Bank of America or Citigroup or Wells Fargo. So the proposal increasingly, starting with some of our groups and your groups and the Inspector General of the Postal Service, and now a very excellent new book by a law professor, it says, why don't we resurrect postal banking? Postal banking was shut down in the post office in 1968. It was a great success. That's why the banks wanted to get rid of it. But it collected the savings and provided simple financial services for people who lived near the post office. What is your movement doing on that? And do you think that's going to become an issue, and whether Bernie Sanders will raise it? 30 million people will benefit, and the post office will benefit. And there are more post offices and post office branches than there is McDonald's and Starbucks and Walmart's combined, all over the country. Very accessible.
No, it's a very important direction, and it's common in many other countries. The Japanese system's got a huge postal banking system because it's very local. It's oriented to low deposits, and it could be done. I think Bernie has picked up on that. I've been told the other day that he's making that an issue. But yes, it's another area where we could see this development. I think what's driving a lot of what's happening, and I think why I'm cautiously optimistic about this direction, is that people are, there's economic and social pain building up, and nobody's passing traditional liberal programs that would help. And I think people are beginning to sort of take it into their own hands and say that it's time to go in a new direction. And that postal banking could be very important in this, I think.
Here's a caution I want to share with you, Gar, and I'm not the only one, that the community development movement is extremely empirical and connects with the needs every day of people. Nobody is going to deny that. On the other hand, can it also begin challenging the massive concentration of wealth, much of it the people's wealth, the commons, for example, the public lands, the public airwaves, the massive R&D that's built all these industries, biotech and pharmaceutical and aerospace and computers. This is all done with taxpayer money, and they don't get anything back for it. And I remember in reading some of your very good books, one phrase stood out when you said that people should start demanding their residual. The residual means getting something for their tax dollars and instead of having their tax dollars go to the top 1% in Wall Street and the global capitalists. So how does this activity also have a good side effect, Gar, in saying, look, we earned it, we want it back, we want this residual back. In Western Europe, they get a residual, which is why there's less grumbling about taxes, because they get tuition-free education, universal health care, better pension plans, great public transit, better public parks, 4 weeks or more paid vacation. I mean, they get something back. Our taxpayers get very little back, which is why there's this almost self-destructive taxpayer rebellion. Instead of going after getting back what they earned, they try to cut it away. And what's your view on this? How can this community development effort, all these institutions, begin having a political impact and saying, look, we want a restored minimum living wage. We want better private pensions. We want a transfer of the bloated military budget into building public works in community after community.
Well, I agree with you entirely. And, there's in one of the books I did that we went through so much of the research that's gone into, for instance, the Internet and the computers that made Bill Gates. That's all public money. And then invention after invention after invention. This has been researched to death. And most of it, if not, of the big things, you find there's public dollars went into it and private gain. Well, if you began tapping some of that kind of funding, what the results of that would be, you'd have an extraordinary kind of benefits for the public would be possible out of what the public already invested. So I think the question becomes building a new politics that understands the relationship between wealth ownership and wealth development and benefits. So far, we haven't done much of that. You, I think, were one of the first ones way back, I think, in the early 70s to push for the co-op bank, which was a piece of that puzzle and could have been developed if we had a political movement to take it in the right direction.
Yes.
But I think the next political movement's got to move towards ownership at every level, and particularly when there's been huge public investment, as there has been in science and technology. We're behind many of the modern developments, so jet airplanes being another obvious one, but the one that is really crucial is the whole Internet system and all of the development. Bill Gates himself, when he developed the operating system that became the basis of his fortune, was working at MIT on a contract paid for by the U.S. government, the taxpayers. So you dig through these things, and after many, many pharmaceuticals, you find the same thing. Television, you find the same thing. The jet aircraft, you find the same thing. The public put the money in, and then the corporations run away with it. And I think that whole idea of who owns things has got to be rebuilt from the bottom up. Co-ops are, co-ops are important, and community ownership is important directly, but even more in beginning to generate an idea about really what should be owned in common and what should not, what should be private, and how do you get a different mix to take back some of these benefits?
Yeah, for our listeners, we own the biggest wealth in the United States by far. The people own the commons. That's 1/3 of America, the public lands, offshore, all the minerals, the forests, the grazing lands, own the public airways, own all this R&D money that made Google and Internet and Intel and Cisco possible. But we don't control of it. It's controlled by the corporations. In other words, we're the landlords of the public airways, but the radio and TV stations are the tenants, and they get control 24 hours a day on our radio and TV stations free through the Federal Communications Commission. So part of it is education, isn't it? We don't grow up knowing about the commons. We don't grow up knowing about the kind of economy you've been talking about. We just grow up to say, hey, you know, it's Horatio Alger. You can be a Wall Street magnate if you work hard and follow the rules. So it starts with our elementary schools, high schools, universities, even at law school. I don't recall ever seeing anything on the commons. The property in this country, it's owned by all the people. Can you
let me pick up one piece of that, Ralph, because as you know, one of the areas where we have seen some really exciting development is in public cable television and public cable networks, because they're beginning to get several. I think the last number I saw were 400 of them, and a number of them in referenda saying that this ought to be public rather than private and give it to Comcast. So there's a movement building up to do the same thing with internet services and local television that we're some actual positive traction on in different parts of the country.
We got to get it into the political arena of elections, just the way the big corporations do. You'll see the debate, the second debate by the Republicans. It's all going to be on economic issues. And, you know, it's going to be Federal Reserve, it's going to be Wall Street, it's going to be tax reductions for big business, deregulation. They control the dialogue. I think we have to turn it around, and you helped a lot in doing this. Let me just ask you, quickly give your website where people can get and find out more, and then I'm going to put a couple questions to you in conclusion.
Let me give you 3 different websites. One is called Community-Wealth. Put the dash in, because there's one without a dash is different, .org or .com. That's where you find reporting on all this stuff we've been talking about in detail. The other one is called the democracycollaborative.org. And that's kind of give you a general idea of what we're doing. And then there is something called thenextsystem.com. And that's a large project trying to open up these questions at the systemic level as well. And it's beginning to get some real traction as to how do we open up big picture of where does this all go. So those are the 3 major websites. And, you'll find a lot of detail in chapter and verse on all that we're talking about there.
And they give you things to do right in your community, like how to push for postal banking. That's where the change comes from. More and more people spending a few hours here and there pressing for this kind of community resurgence and development. In one of your materials, you say there are also now more than 11,000 employee-owned firms, ESOPs they're called, more than 11,000 employee-owned firms in the United States, which employ more people than workers in America's private sector labor unions. Now, it's been said that the ESOP is really a tax dodge, that the workers really don't control these companies, and that the companies don't behave all that differently from companies that are owned by stockholders. What's your answer?
Well, it's a very good point, because the ESOP, its employee stock ownership plan structure, is a permissive structure. There are certain tax advantages, and this is very common now because so many people are retiring. If you own a company and sell it to your workers through this ESOP mechanism, you get a tax break. So that's a really important time. It can be structured with unions, there are several with unions, and as democratic ownership and control. Most of them are not. Most of them, people haven't woken up to it. They're controlled by a trust, and they're just like any other company, except the workers themselves get a bigger share of the profits. That is a big change. So there is a movement within the ESOP movement to try to democratize and use the power that they have to have democratic control. But it's a very small movement so far. We'd like to see encouragement. But the fact is, labor unions, unfortunately, have been going down in numbers, and worker ownership through ESOPs and co-ops have gone up over the last 30 years. So there's a possibility here of really something happening if people began demanding what's already available to them under law, but they haven't been taking advantage of it. It's been kind of a tax dodge for some people selling their needs for many people.
I think that's the key point you just made. It's the Achilles heel of co-ops and all kinds of worker-owned enterprises. That is, folks, if you don't become active as a member of a co-op, if you don't become active as a member of an employee-owned firm, et cetera, the structures aren't going to work to the potential that they can work. And so it is changing our culture, changing the way we use some of our time, raising our expectation levels, rather than just paying through the nose for convenience of having stuff delivered instantly to us when we buy it from Amazon or elsewhere. And Amazon is doing a lot to destroy the very kind of community that Gar is trying to rebuild with his movement. Just to change the subject to something extremely important historically, the bombing Hiroshima, bombing Nagasaki. After that occurred, the American people were told by the military establishment and the political establishment, especially Harry Truman, that if we didn't do that, we would have had to take Japan door-to-door fighting. 1 million American soldiers would have died. And so that is why destroying over 300,000 lives in a matter of seconds in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention the cancer that followed, was necessary. Well, as a young man, you dug into this history, and you came out with some pretty astounding findings about what some of our leading generals thought in contrast to Harry Truman. Can you just tell us, was it necessary to drop those 2 bombs, which were dropped deliberately to kill civilians? That was the plan. They were not military targets.
I wrote a book, this was my doctoral dissertation many years ago at Cambridge University, and then I wrote another one on the 50th anniversary. We now have documents for most of the story, but not all of it. The fact is that, think about this, President Dwight Eisenhower is on record publicly and privately in his memoirs, but publicly he said it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. That's a direct quote. He claims he told President Truman not to do it, and he certainly told the Secretary of War Stimson not to do it. The Chief of Staff to the President, a 5-star admiral at the time, head of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called it outrageous, a barbarian thing. Almost every major general and admiral who was in the know on the inside, the highest men, are publicly on record saying the use of that atomic bomb was totally unnecessary. Many historians now finally have come to realize, one, the bombing was totally unnecessary. Most people agree with that now who've studied the documents. That's common knowledge among historians.
What do they mean by unnecessary?
The war was about to end. And anyway, all the Japanese were asking for was that we not get rid of their emperor in some kind of form without any power, because they regarded him as a god. And we'd already decided that internally we were going to kick the emperor because he would help control the military. So there was no difference in what was going to happen. And the Japanese were trying to get out of the war. We had broken the Japanese codes. We knew that they were begging to get out of the war. And there couldn't have been an invasion for another 3 months because we had to move all our troops over to do an invasion. So most historians recognize now fully that the use of the atomic bomb was totally unnecessary. The real debate was it known at the time? And the answer to that now is that the codes were broken, and the top military people, virtually all of them, are on record saying they understood the war could be ended without the bomb. The Joint Chiefs of Staff begged Truman at the Potsdam Conference just before the bomb was used. The British and the American Joint Chiefs of Staff begged Truman to say what they were going to say anyway. You can keep your emperor if you don't have power. They knew they were going to do that anyway. And they said the war would end. We wouldn't have to kill so many people. They were horrified by this. You find the U.S. military was almost to a person horrified. If you go down to the Naval Museum, as opposed to the Air Force Museum, you'll find a plaque on the wall that says, "Right today," it was discovered very recently. Somebody pointed it out to me and sent me a picture. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not a military decision. It was decided by the politicians. The military was basically against it. So
Japan,
we know this story pretty well.
Japan was in ruins. I mean, the military was destroyed. Japan was in ruins. And the question is, Gar, why did President Harry Truman give the order? And why did he do it again a few days later in Nagasaki?
That's where it gets pretty speculative, but not entirely speculative. The strongest interpretation, and we don't have many records on this. They didn't keep public records of any kind. There is a lot of evidence that what they were really showing the bomb for was to show the Russians that the United States had this new power, and that's what you really were talking about. And they also wanted to end the war before the Russians could get in. We've been begging the Russians to come in and help us before the bomb was started. And then with the bomb, we showed them this new muscle. Harry Truman called it, "I've got a hammer on those boys," a direct quote. The Secretary of State, James F. Burns, who really ran the show for Truman, was quite open with the scientists. He met with them in May, and he said, "I know the war is going to end, but we need the bomb, quote, to make the Russians more manageable." Now, we can't prove all of this because there aren't any really solid documents, but the strongest line of evidence strongly suggests they were thinking about, this is going to give us real clout in the post-war struggle against the Russians. That's where the interpretations and the evidence points, and one day we'll have more documents and be able to really nail it down to the wall.
Of course, there was enormous state terrorism by the Japanese and German military in Europe and Asia. But right now we're just talking about the decision to drop the atomic bomb on civilians for the first time in history. In conclusion, Gar, is it fair to say, using modern lingo, that the attack on civilians, hospitals, schools, residential areas, blowing up Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were not really military targets, against the advice of our top military commands, including General Eisenhower, is it fair to say that this was a massive demonstration of state terrorism?
You could call it that. You could probably call it a war crime. It's only been litigated once, and it's really interesting. And we tried to search there ought to be some real legal work done on this. The Tokyo courts litigated it once and so found. But think about it this way. The Japanese young men of military age were all out at war. Who was left in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were young kids, women, and old people. And they were bombed. Neither one of those places had a significant military installation. They did have small and modest military installations, but they were not regarded as significant. That's why they'd never been bombed throughout the war. They were left unblemished. And basically, those are the people we killed in that period. And it's a very, very nasty story about American diplomacy and politics.
And there never was going to be an invasion and door-to-door fighting, exposing our soldiers. That's what they were telling our soldiers, by the way.
No, the soldiers were told that. They believed it, understandably. At the highest levels, the generals and admirals, they knew the war was over. You couldn't have an invasion. They had to, for another 3 months, because you had to bring up all the troops and all the supplies. They knew the war was going to end within a couple of weeks in August rather than in November. So there's a lot of mythology here, and it's not particularly pleasant mythology.
And your two books' name on the subject, could you give that to listeners as we close?
Well, the biggest one, which I did at the 50th anniversary, is called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. Very simple. The first one that broke open this debate is called Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam. Potsdam was the conference in Germany where the decision was made. But the decision to use the atomic bomb is kind of easy to remember, and that's out there and available and kind of lays out the details.
I have a question. Do we know how Stalin reacted to the atomic bomb? Did it temper his military decisions in any way?
What we know is that he sped up the decision to try to build nuclear weapons for the Russians and intensified the whole overall effort. There's a lot of evidence that before the atomic bomb was developed, and this was the Roosevelt policy, there was kind of a reason for the Russians and the Americans to cooperate. And that reason was a big one, which was we needed them to help us hold down Germany in the post-war period. And they needed us to help hold down Germany. So there was a kind of a basis for kind of a mutual agreement to kind of hold things together in the post-war period. Well, the atomic bomb both kind of scared the Russians, which is the things we wanted to do, unfortunately. And also, we didn't need the Russians anymore once we had the atomic bomb to control the Germans. So it kind of made the possibility of an alliance based on real politics disappeared. It got very ugly in 1946 and 1947.
But I mean, Truman was aware that Stalin was going to encroach on Eastern Europe, and once Germany fell. So I mean, could an argument? I mean, wouldn't people who argue with you say, well, we had to kill 1 million lives to save 3 million? That kind of argument.
Well, I think the there were people who thought that you could get the Russians out of Eastern Europe, but not many of them really believed that, because the Russians had been invaded through Eastern Europe so many times, with 30 million lost during World War II. They were clearly not going to let the invasion route be controlled by somebody else, given what they'd experienced. The conservatives within the U.S. government, Secretary of War Stimson, was saying basically, look, if we clamp down, they're going to get tougher in Eastern Europe. If we ease up, we've got a chance of them easing up. So there's a whole argument made by some of the sophisticated conservatives that we made it a lot worse by trying to get tough on them at that point. For instance, General Marshall, who was head of the U.S. military, at one point said, if we clamp down, they're going to take Czechoslovakia. And that's, Czechoslovakia was not, it was occupied, but it was a democratic system at that point. And boom, as soon as we clamped down, they clamped down. So there's a whole other story about the Cold War and what the Russians might have done or might not have done. It had different things gone a different way. Roosevelt had a different policy.
Yeah.
I have another question, and this is not a moral question, but a practical one. It's kind of along the same lines as David. Is there any argument to be made, in retrospect, that because we saw the horrors of the atomic bomb of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that in the long term, it has had an arresting effect on our willingness to use it again, that it made it real instead of being an abstract concept? What would your view on that be?
You know, it's very speculative. I think there is something to that argument. On the other hand, what's happened is nuclear proliferation all over the world, because there's no arms control. Rather than, we wanted to build up more and more nuclear weapons, and we really didn't want to have arms control in any serious way. So what you've got is a lot of possibilities for either accidents or terrorism. If you look at the Pakistani nuclear installation and the really rabid kind of religious control of some parts of that, there's a lot of nasty stuff that's flowed from this. People there was an attempt to cut short the arms race. What you say is true. Nobody wants to see the atomic bombs start to fly, but on the other hand, I think our policy contributed to building up the arms race around the world. We knew that once we had them, the other guys would try to get them too, because they had to. So it's not a great story either way.
Can I ask Ralph a question and then have the professor respond about Social Security? Has there ever been talk of taking our Social Security and investing it in the Fortune 500 companies to gain a better return for retirees, and what effect that would have on corporate decision-making? Would that ever be allowed in this country?
No, right now it's not allowed. The Republicans in Congress wanted to do that, and they were beaten back a few years ago.
That would be done through private accounts, but I'm talking about like official Social Security investments.
Yeah, no, the surplus. Well, the surplus doesn't exist. It's just government IOUs, because the huge surplus that was built up after the 1983 Social Security agreement between the Republicans and Democrats under Reagan, it was used for daily government deficit spending, military deficit spending, other kinds of deficit spending. And so it's just government IOUs, that's all. And it's pretty hard to mess around with government IOUs in the U.S. stock market. So, well, thank you very much, Gar Alperovitz. This has really been a very interesting discussion. I hope people who are listening will go to the website, community_wealth.org, and other websites that are cited, and participate in the community. Learn what other communities have done. It was done by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. You can do the same thing in your community. Thank you very much, Gar.
Thanks, Ralph. Good to be with you.
We've been talking to Gar Alperovitz. To find out more about his work on community wealth building, go to either community-wealth.org or democracycollaborative.org or thenextsystem.org. And his book about the atomic bomb is The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. We'll link to that on our website. Hi, everybody. Steve Scrovan here. This is a special announcement for our podcast audience only, especially those of you who live in Southern California. I know we have a lot of Southern California listeners. I want to invite you to a stand-up comedy show that I am organizing to benefit the work of Public Citizen. It's called Stand Up for Main Street. It's going to be on Sunday, November 1st at the WGA Theater in Beverly Hills at 6:30 p.m. Now, this is the 5th year in a row I've put this on. It's always a fantastic evening of laughter and inspiration. In the past, we've had tremendous comedians like Bill Burr and Greg Fitzsimmons and Mark Merritt and Ray Romano and Kevin Nealon, Dimitri Martin, Paula Poundstone, Jeff Garland, Dom Herrera, Dana Gould. And we've got another great show lined up for you this year. This year, we are featuring Gerard Carmichael of NBC's The Carmichael Show. We've got Brent Morin from the NBC show Undateable. We have Kira Sultanovich, who you may know from The Tonight Show. She does my friend David Feldman's podcast all the time. We have Jimmy O. Yang from Silicon Valley, Beth Stelling, who's appeared in Conan and Jimmy Kimmel Live, and my good friend Angelo Tsaroukas from Last Comic Standing, and the incomparable political satirist who's coming down special from San Francisco, Will Durst. And it's hosted by me, and that's Sunday, November 1st, at the WGA Theater, 135 South Doheny in Beverly Hills, 6:30 showtime. Go to citizen.org, click on the Stand Up for Main Street button that will take you to the page where you can buy tickets. And even if you're not in the LA area, you can help us out by going to Facebook, searching for Stand Up for Main Street 5, and sharing the post with your friends. So that's Sunday, November 1st, 6:30 p.m., WGA Theater for Stand Up for Main Street 5. Go to citizen.org for tickets. Now back to the show. Before we get to your listener questions, we're going to take a short break to check in with the corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 30, 2015. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Politicians and law enforcement officials in the United States make a big deal about foreign bribery. But Mike Kaler, an assistant professor at the Southern Illinois University School of Law, wants to know, what about bribery right here in the United States? And what about bribery committed by our own government? Kaler says that it's much easier to point the finger at corrupt foreign officials and corrupt foreign business practices than it is to look in the mirror and realize that much of what the U.S. government labels corruption abroad happens right here at home. The elephant in the room is a system of legalized domestic bribery in the United States. Why make a distinction between cash payments bribery and Citizens United bribery? For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Remember, if you have missed any of this episode on the radio, you can go to RalphNaderRadioHour.com and catch up with our conversations with Gar Alperovitz or any of the other informative conversations we've had on our previous 84 episodes. We provide links to guests and their work. You can submit questions. And we have also added a new feature, a downloadable PDF transcript of the show. You'll see the link posted just above the audio player on your computer. I said you could ask questions by going to Ralph Nader Radio Hour. So let's get right to them, Steve.
All right. Our first question, Ralph, is from Scott Benowitz. And he says, do you believe that statehood status for Washington, D.C. might realistically be achievable anytime within the foreseeable future?
Not if the Republicans control the Congress, because they don't want two more Democratic senators and one more Democratic representative. But in 2009 and 2010, when President Obama and the Congress were Democratic, and President Obama said that he favored statehood, although not in an official statement, just in a private remark that was overheard at a gathering. That was the best time to get statehood. People may not know around the country that people in the District of Columbia cannot vote for members of Congress who have the vote. They have a representative, but she doesn't have a vote. She just is an observer there. And this is the only state capital in the Western world where the people are disenfranchised. So the argument for it is pretty overwhelming. I think it would have great support, obviously, in the District of Columbia. The Democrats had a great chance to do it in 2009, 2010, but they never even actually proposed it. So the answer is not until the Democrats get control of Congress and the White House at the same time and really want to give the people of the District of Columbia what democracy is supposed to be all about, which is voting members in the Congress.
Why was it set up that way in the first place?
Yeah, I was just going to ask that.
And I asked it first, not you, David.
Okay.
Yeah. It was set up that way in the first place because it wanted to depoliticize the federal district. And it was carved out of Maryland largely. and it's pretty small. It's got about 700,000 people at the most living there. But a lot of them are not from the District of Columbia, especially the power brokers, and they don't seem to mind not having to vote in Congress. They have other ways of influencing Congress, all the trade associations and all the lobbyists.
This question comes from John Rakowski. He says, Ralph, how could a third party that represents the American people be successfully formed?
If a lot of people like you roll up their sleeves and start chapters of a third party, run local candidates to give the third party a real base at the state and federal level, then move to the state candidates, and then move to the national. That's not likely to happen unless we get some maybe 1,000 of very active people all over the country to get going. I don't think it takes more than that, actually. But that's a big order, given how few people have tried in the past. The other answer to your question is, if a multi-billionaire or billionaire gets in and starts a party, billionaires get credibility by the press. They get credibility by pollsters. Ross Perot, for example, tossed it into a three-way race with his Reform Party in 1992. But he got 19 million votes and not a single electoral vote. And that has discouraged people like former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, who told me once that he would run if he thought he could win, but he thought the system was so full of hereditary Republican and Democratic voters and so rigged at the Electoral College that he wouldn't have a chance even if he got tens of millions of votes. So there's no doubt, though, that if any billionaire got into the race in the coming year, that person could turn it into a three-way race, because a lot of people are turned off the two parties.
Now, is the Green Party the closest thing we have to something resembling a third party? Do they have enough of a foundation?
No, they don't, unfortunately. And the largest third party traditionally in the last few decades has been the Libertarian Party. They get more votes than Green Party candidates, except when I was on the Green Party ticket, I got quite a lot more votes than the Libertarian Party. So I think coming up, unless something changes, of the two parties, the Libertarians will get a little more votes, but none of them get even close to 1 million votes.
Well, as the standard bearer for the Green Party in the early 2000s, you weren't interested beyond that in building it up. What's your personal view of all of that?
I spent a lot of time in 2001 going to Green Party gatherings, fundraisers, and it was like pushing a string. These are people who are well-intentioned, but they're not serious enough to raise enough money to hire full-time staff and open Green Party offices around the country, which is what you got to do to start recruiting candidates. That was the problem. I gave it a good push, but it didn't work.
Our next question comes from Ricky Steamboat. Sometimes I think we've got some pseudonyms going on here.
Yeah, who would call themselves Ricky?
That's right. And it actually plays right into what we were talking about, because Ricky asked, do you support the fair debate fight taking place now with the Green Party and Libertarian Party? If so, do you plan to endorse it and offer your presence? If not, why?
Well, I support the Green Party and Libertarian Party candidates being on the national presidential debates. That's where the big audience is. They can have their own debates, the little parties, but they're not going to get much exposure. In fact, there was one in 2008, and the Washington Post ignored it, the New York Times ignored it, and it was right in Washington, D.C. I was participating in it. And they had 4 candidates from 4 small parties, including the Green Party and Libertarian Party. The Debate Commission, listeners should know, is a private corporation set up in 1987 by the Republican and Democratic parties to get rid of the League of Women Voters' supervision of presidential campaigns, because it could control the League of Women Voters the way they wanted to. So now we have this private corporation in conjunction with the mass media deciding who gets on, who doesn't, who's chosen as reporters to ask what questions. It's incredibly incestuous between this two-party tyranny. And no matter how many audiences of huge size you get campaigning around the country, as I did for the Green Party in 2000, filled Madison Square Garden and other giant arenas, I didn't reach more than 2% of the people I could have reached had the Debate Commission listened to national polls that wanted me and Pat Buchanan on the stage, if only to reduce drowsiness among the public.
Right. It's really interesting to watch debates that were sponsored by the League of Women Voters, because the moderators were moderating members of the press. You had about 5 members of the press asking questions. Now it's just one person asking them.
Yeah, no, not only that, David, they're not really debates. They're not going after each other and challenging each other. They're multiple news conferences. And that's what we're seeing this year. And that's why they get away with it, because they can predict most of the questions or dodge them, and time's up and they go to the next candidate with the next question. It's only when they mix it up with each other, like if Bernie Sanders mixed it up with Hillary Clinton, he could nail her on a lot of things, which he hasn't done. And if he doesn't do it, how can we believe he's really serious in defeating her?
Frank Black writes, Dear Ralph, why do we still bother? The world will be unlivable in 50 years. This is not a joke question.
First of all, there's a book called Why Bother by Sam Smith, who is a very wise person. He's now moved from D.C. to Maine. You should look it up. He answers your question. Another answer to your question is, what if our ancestors said, why bother? What kind of world would we inherit from them? And what kind of world do we want our children and grandchildren to inherit if we're known as quitters and we let a few people around the world ravage the world and destroy the planet so that our descendants end up with a world of huge cruelty, deprivation, and injustice?
At the opening of the Tort Museum, I don't know who it was, but somebody quoted you. You were once interviewed by a reporter, and she said, how do you keep going? Do you remember what the answer was that you gave, Ralph?
Justice.
No, you said, I don't do mood swings.
Oh, that was another answer. That's right. Yeah. That's right. You can't get discouraged if you're striving for justice, because you're not going to win likely on the first round. You got to show failure, resilience, and overcome it and learn from your last mistakes. I mean, that's the mature approach. Where did they have that attitude? It's called the sports arena, right?
Right.
Nobody gives up on the sports arena. Nobody goes to the basketball coach in the late third quarter and say, well, we're behind 40 points, and, why stress out? I mean, why don't we just call it a day? I mean, that would be the end of the player's career. So we've got to get civic stamina, civic maturity. Just takes 1% or less, folks, representing a majority public opinion to turn this country around.
I get asked that question a lot too, through doing the radio show and being on the board of Public Citizen. And that's a very real psychological thing, because people sense the forces arrayed against us are so large and so opaque. And, I basically say, yeah, that may be true, but I'm going to go down with my boots on. I want to be able to look my children and their grandchildren in the face and say, when all this was going down, what side were you on? So.
And there's another saying, which is, once the people get aroused, and it's only the people that have the vote, not the corporations, they have the money, but what really counts in Congress is not just the money, it's the votes. They want the money to get the votes with ads on TV, etc. So if you cut off the money at the pass with targeted, intelligent votes demanding that members of Congress listen and do what the people need done on their behalf, then the saying comes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Well, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you for all your questions, and I'm very happy we were able to get to a whole slew of them today. I want to thank our guest today, Gar Alperovitz. Go to garalperovitz.com to find out more about him. Go to Community Wealth, community-wealth, to find out about the Community Wealth movement. Also, you can go to democracycollaborative.org or thenextsystem.org for that again. And his book is called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. So pick that up. We'll link to it on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. And Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. Remember to visit the country's only law museum. We just spoke of it, the American Museum of Tort Law in Winstead, Connecticut. Go to tortmuseum.org. We've got you all .org here today. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. On behalf of David Feldman, I'm Steve Scrovan. Until next week, Ralph.
Thank you very much, David and Steve. And the listeners, spread the word and connect with the kind of work that Gar Alperovitz has been doing in his website, community-wealth.org.
Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person.